Bueno, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Moitas grazas pola vosa presenza nesta sesión do Seminario Sentidos das Culturas, dentro do subciclo dedicado aos temas de emigración, balados, que se desenvolve no Consello da Cultura Galega. Hoxe nos acompaña NIRA YUVAL-DAVIS, como sempre tedes no programa de man pois, o texto que xa se adiantou, mesmo unha biografía. Quero salientar que ao longo da súa obra, tanto nos seus temas e traballos abordados durante anos sobre o problema da muller, a nación, a emigración, foi desenvolvendo o concepto que hoxe nos vai a expoñer, que aparentemente abstracto, esta idea de interseccionalidade situada, sin embargo, pois de extrema utilidade para abordar problemas candentes da nosa actualidade. Daí ese interese. Eu quixera subliñar que, aparte do seu labor docente e investigador na Universidade de East London, ten desenvolto numerosísimos proxectos de investigación e de traballo de campo en diversos países, tamén en Londres, precisamente sobre o problema de migración, o problema da muller, desde unha óptica que vencella tanto a dimensión teórica como a dimensión sociolóxica e empírica, e dai ese interese canda, como digo, a chega de conceptos fundamentais para entendermos o noso tempo. No desenvolvimento da sesión faremos, como sempre, a súa intervención e logo preguntas que desexades propoñer ou cuestións que desexades suscitar. Temos a fortuna nesta sesión organizada simultaneamente pola sección de Pensamento e Sociedade e a sección de Igualdade do Consello. Como digo, contamos coa presencia tamén de Guadalupe Jiménez, profesora de Antropoloxía na Facultade de Filosofía, pois coñecedora da obra de NIRA YUVAL-DAVIS, e nos axudará tamén pois, ao fío de traducción de algúns termos, e se queredes clarificar que algunhas contestación ou preguntas na quenda de intervencións co público. Xa dixemos que vai falar en inglés, vai non facer despacio e se ofrece a matizar cantas expresións no debate, como se ela mesma insistiu nesto, se alguén quer interrumpila para algunha aclaración durante a súa intervención tamén o pode facer. A idea é precisamente salvar as diferencias idiomáticas que podan aparecer e aclarármonos todos no seu pensamento e nas súas achegas. Por a miña parte, sin máis que agradecerlle a súa presencia, much indeed for the effort you've made today in this session. When you like, please.
Thank you very much, Ron. First of all, apologies that I don't speak Spanish, so I cannot speak to you in Spanish today. If I'll try, as I promised, to speak slowly, and I will be reminded if I forget myself. But if you do not understand, please don't hesitate to lift your hand and stop me. I don't consider this impolite. I consider it impolite if you pretend to listen and you don't follow what I'm saying. If you disagree with me, please don't raise your hand. That we can discuss at the end. Now, when Ramon first contacted me, he told me that this is about a series of seminars about the meanings of culture. And he wanted me to relate it to issues of migration, multiculturalism, borders, etc. Upon reflection upon it, I thought that, of course, these are the important issues of the day, and we should discuss them. But before we can discuss them, we have to, at least before I discuss them, I am doing it from a particular theoretical and methodological perspective. So I thought I cannot assume that you would know what situated intersectionality is, and therefore, before we can discuss this particular current political issues, I need to present to you this theoretical framework, theoretical, methodological, epistemological framework. So what I'm going to do is to start by presenting the methodological and theoretical framework of situated intersectionality. Then I'm going to discuss the issue of culture and the meaning of culture, and then interrelate the two. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to present a series of points which relate to some of the current concrete political debates. So the basic argument of what I'm saying is that when we look at the meaning of culture, we need a dialogical epistemology. This is the only way, or the only, I think, valid way in order to understand culture, which goes in the face of some of the more traditional perspectives of understanding culture. In order to understand this dialogical epistemology, as I said, we need the theoretical methodological framework of situated intersectionality. So what is it? Intersectionality has been called the most important theoretical contribution that women's studies in conjunction with related fields has made to general political theory. And indeed, the imprint of intersectional analysis can be easily traced to innovation in equality legislation, human rights, and development discourses. However, given its multiple and multidisciplinarian history, intersectionality is not a unified body of theory, but more a range of theoretical and conceptual tools. But as such, it's the same as any other kind of major theoretical field, from Marxism and socialism to liberalism to feminism and so on. So I am going to present here my particular version of intersectionality, which is quite different in some ways and similar in other ways from other intersectionality approaches. And this is why I've called it situated intersectionality. The intersectionality in general has originally developed as a counter to what is known as identity politics. Identity politics have been homogenizing a whole category of people and collapsed individuals and collective. So people could say, as a woman, I can tell you, as if all women are the same. As a Black, as a Jew, as a sociologist, I can tell you. But I cannot tell you because not all women, not all Black, not all Jews, not all sociologists think the same, have the same normative value system, or the same social economic positioning and location in the power hierarchies in society. So intersectionality has come as a counter theoretical and ideological framework to this identity politics. However, some interpretations of intersectionality have become fragmented identity politics. Not as a woman, I can tell you, as a man, I can tell you, but as a Black woman, I can tell you, or as a Black, middle-aged, disabled woman, I can tell you. The way I, and of course many others, approach intersectionality does not fix and homogenize even each subgrouping, nor do we equate social category, like the gender category of men and women, or the ethnic national category of being Spanish or Galician or Jewish or Catholic, with social grouping. Often there are social groupings which gather together around particular social category, but not always. Sometimes also the positive side of identity politics has been to mobilize and create new political and social movements around particular social categories which were not organized before, like disabled, like indigenous people, like refugees, etc. However, intersectionality, situated intersectionality, looks at the different social categories, the social divisions, as in concrete situation, mutually constituting and shaping each other, although ontologically they cannot be reduced to each other. For example, to be a Black woman in Spain today is different than being a Black man in Spain today, and it's different than being a Black or man or woman in Zimbabwe or in the United States or in Britain. And it's different if you are talking about young or old, gay or straight, educated, not educated, etc. So in the concrete, there isn't a meaning of what a woman is. You can only have a woman in particular concrete, historical, temporal, spatial, and social situation. But ontologically, gender is anchored in discourses relating to sexuality and reproduction. Class is anchored in discourses relating to production and consumption. You have ethnicity and race relating to discourses about construction of more or less essentialist boundaries among collectivities of people. So this is something which we all have to remember when we talk about analysis of social relations. I've had debates with other advocates of intersectionality who claimed that in order not to lose its political meaning, intersectionality should be applied only to the most racialized, disadvantaged, marginalized women of color, from where historically, but not exclusively, the theorization of intersectionality has emerged. I have argued the opposite, that the same way that not only Blacks have color, also white, not only people from the minorities have culture, also the hegemonic majority, it is very naturalizing to think that there is no specific culture or race or gender. You know, humanity used to be equated with men before feminism. So if we don't want to be part of the exceptionalism, let alone surveillance of racialized, disadvantaged, marginalized people in society, we have to apply this kind of analysis to all people. Oh dear, I was assuming everybody would turn off the phone before we start. Okay. Now, when we use intersectionality in this way, I am professionally a sociologist. Usually, the way that hierarchies of power and resources among people in sociological theory has been theorized with what is known the stratification theory. But this basically has been a study of class relations, the economic positioning in relation to production, employment, as well as consumption, the more culturalist studies like Bourdieu and so on. But I've, and others have argued that the most valid and comprehensive approach to stratification should be intersectionality, because it doesn't reduce the complexity of power relations only to issues of socioeconomic resources. It looks at social capital, cultural capital, to use some of the Bourdieu notions, but also include the importance of accessibility to resources and power, of being a member of different genders, of different ethnic and racial groups, of different stage in the life cycle, ability, etc. So basically, therefore, the issue of or the analysis of situated intersectionality has to include the situated gazes of all those who are differentially located in the different power axle or grids in society. Now, of course, this kind of location of categories is in itself has to be looked at not in essentialist and fixed terms. It's always shifting and contested and not necessarily symmetrical. We had a debate, for example, talking about asymmetry of boundary, whether Jews can be members of the German nation or blacks can be part of the British nation. I know here in Spain there is a whole debate whether, you know, Catalan, Basque, and so on should have their own separate nation or be part of the Spanish nation. In Britain, in recent Brexit, to what extent can one be British and European? Or when I conducted research with people from other countries in the EU, when people talked about Europe, very often they talked about continental Europe, but Britain was part and not part of this construction of Europe. So it's not necessarily always symmetrical, and of course it's shifting. Britain after Brexit is not like Britain before Brexit. So in order to understand the meaning of social divisions or social categories, we have to explore them in what Leslie McCall, when she talked about intersectionality methodology, talked about intercategorical way. So we need to look what nationalism means, let's say, in Spain today and in Spain 100 years ago, in Spain today and in Britain today. So you have here both a temporal and a spatial situatedness. But also there is a question of scale. What does nation mean in the United Nations in relation to Galicia? The multi-scalar divisions and comparisons, as well as temporal and spatial. But the differential perspective of situatedness, as I started, is not just intercategorical, interlocational, interspatial, interscalar, but also within particular social situation. If we take this context of the lecture, my situated gaze as an invited guest speaker, your situated gaze or gazes as people, either some of you organized the meeting, some of you have been coming regularly to this kind of seminars, some of you are the first time, some of you are students, some of you are, you know, in a more kind of professional, different kind of position. So in order to understand the meaning of particular situation, social encounter, you need to have a kind of dialogical epistemology. As Patricia Hill Collins said, truth exists, but we can only approach it. And we can approach it by the wider the dialogue. The wider we have the interpretation of a particular social meaning from people who have different situated gazes. And of course, it's not just the gazes, because the gazes are constructed and mediated via situated knowledges, which related to the different social locations, to different identification, different normative value system of the particular participation, not just situated knowledge, but also situated imagination, because the situated imagination in some ways creates the categories in which knowledge is possible or impossible. So until now, I talked about situated intersectionality. I would like to move now to talk about culture specifically, but has anything of what I've said until now been not clear? Any misunderstanding? I have bad sight, but do you see any I don't, okay. Okay. So let me move now then to the notion of culture. Even more than many other central concepts in social sciences, the definition and meaning of the term culture has been contested. Raymond Williams, who is considered to be the forefathers of cultural studies, Stuart Hall is a father, so Raymond Williams maybe is a grandfather, I don't know. He kind of suggested three very different meanings of the ways we use culture, which often, if we are not clear that there are different meanings, would color and shadows our understanding of what culture is. One term is that of a general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. Culture as civilization. According to this notion of culture, all human beings have, and maybe all Martians as well, I mean, have one kind of continuum of culture, and we are all located at different stages of development. One of the ideological justification of colonialism, and even like in Palestine where I grew up, there was a British mandate, then the justification has been that these nations are not mature enough to govern themselves. They didn't reach this stage in their cultural civilization development. So this is one meaning. The second meaning is what can be called high culture, which relates to the work and practices of intellectual and artistic activity. So this Center for Cultural Activities here probably is specified to cultural activities of particular art, particular music, particular literature, particular philosophy. But there is a third one, which is mostly used in the social science rather than in the humanities, which is a way of life which is composed from the values the members of a given group hold, the norms they follow, and the material goods they create. Now, as you would see, or probably you can guess also from the way I talked about situated intersectionality as a tool to understand culture, all these notions of culture and all these notions of way of life and practices, I considered as embedded in particular historical and spatial power relations. So this is just kind of a comment in order for you to see the context of this understanding of the meaning of culture. Jonathan Friedman, who has looked at the emergence of the culture concept in anthropology, described its long and confusing history, especially in the 19th century, but also in the 20th, between with a conflation of these three different meanings of the concept of culture. This conflation enabled the conflation of culture with race. If culture was stage in human development, if culture was a way of life, then every race, every nation, any kind of species of people in a homogeneous and undifferentiated way has their particular essentialist bounded culture. Of course, these have lingered much beyond the 19th century or the early 20th century. I remember towards the end of the 20th century looking at the global cultural atlas published by UNESCO, the UN organization of culture, and it divided the world into homogeneous, fixed, mutually excluding zones and countries of different kind of culture. In short, this atlas embodied all what I'm against in understanding of culture, as you will see shortly. It was culture both as the Volkgeist, as the spirit of the people, which is essential and eternal. Now, this has been a part of a universalist paradigm of culture. So there is one generic human culture in which different people and grouping have particular rank according to their stage of development. This paradigm has been rejected by many anthropologists who presented what can be described as a relativist construction of culture. So that Clifford Geertz, for example, said every country have its own kind of specific culture. And you cannot really compare between them. We can see this very much as some of the relativist kind of views, even today, when you have, I was in Vienna in the 90s in the UN Conference for Human Rights. And in the NGO forum of this, we had a lot of debates about notions. For example, we claimed women's rights are human rights. And one of the counter discourses to women's rights are human rights have been what was called then the specificity of the so-called Asian values, according to which men and women are different. You cannot say that they're equal because each of them have their own place in society. Of course, those who says women's rights are human rights would say, no, this kind of construction of the so-called Asian values make exception of women under these Asian values from entitlements to the same equal rights as other women in other parts of the world. I remember after the Iranian Revolution, there was a court case in Britain in which a woman who escaped Iran because she didn't want to be forced to wear the headscarf. So she claimed asylum as a refugee in Britain on this gender discrimination basis. And the judge told her, sorry, according to your culture, women have to wear the headscarf, and therefore this is not discrimination against you being forced to wear a headscarf. So this is a relativist perception of culture from the universalist, which very would just homogenize all human culture as the same, just in different stages of development. Now, this is also been part of a ongoing debate which said you seem to be the opposite, the universalist and the relativist, but you both share a fixed, homogenizing, static, and essentialist view of what culture is. There is a whole series of theorists very much influenced by Gramsci and Foucault, Homi Bhabha, Chatterjee and Bottomley and others, who point out that rather than having a centralist view of culture as having specific fixed cultural stuff of symbols, way of behavior, and artifacts which coherently and unproblematically constitute cultures of specific national and ethnic collectivities, There are always internal differentiations and differences in positioning that cannot be counted for in either of these two approaches. A much more useful way of theorizing culture that has been developed, in which cultures have been transformed from static, reified, homogeneous phenomena common to all members of the national and ethnic collectivities into dynamic social processes operating in contested terrains in which different voices become more or less hegemonic in their offered interpretations of the world. They point out that cultural discourses often resemble more a battleground of meaning rather than a shared point of departure. Cultural homogeneity in this view would be a result of hegemonization, and it would always be limited and more noticeable in the center rather than in the social margin. So when culture is hegemonic, it becomes naturalized. But hegemony is linked to power relations. So it is not that this culture is more natural or more essential or fixed. It is just that those who influence, who have the most important and powerful voices in the society, can hold and repress all the contesting voices which pick up other elements of this culture. So, in this sense, culture and cultural resources are always there and used, but they always have internal contradictions which are and different political projects would always, whether cultural, religious, or of governance or others, would pick up different elements in this selectivity. This raises questions about continuity and persistence of cultures, as well as about the boundaries and the relationships of different cultures. Anthony Smith and Armstrong both argue that cultural myths and symbols have an enduring ability which is being reproduced generation after generation, notwithstanding changing historical and material conditions. However, this seeming endurability can be very misleading. Firstly, because our view of it stems from a very particular temporal gaze. We can see all the cultural stuff that endured, but we cannot see the cultural stuff that didn't endure. Secondly, even if it endured, its contemporary meaning can be very different than generations ago. So, while some portray the world in terms of clashes between separate and opposing clashing civilization, like Huntington, others are much more aware of the synthetic nature of all contemporary cultures, their appropriations of symbolic artifacts and meanings from other civilizations, and their own internal heterogeneity and contestation. This is why, for me, one of the words I hate most is authenticity, because authenticity implies an essential, eternal truth about particular meaning, about particular culture, etc. How am I doing in terms of time? Not well, yeah. So, Of course, in culture, we have the contradictory impulse of continuity as well as of resistance in change. But we need to look, therefore, as culture as rich resource, usually full of internal contradictions, which is used selectively by different social agents in various different projects within specific power relations and political discourses in and outside the collectivity. Gender, class, membership in a collectivity, stage in the life cycle, ability, all affect the access and availability of these resources and the specific positioning from which they are being used. Therefore, situated intersectionality is a crucial methodological tool in analyzing and deciphering the meaning of culture. So, even when we go out of the dichotomy of universalist and relativist, it is very important that if we go back to the multi-scalar as well as multi-locational and multi-temporal mode of valid situated intersectional analysis, we have to, if we go back to the kind of intercategorical versus intracategorical methodologies that have been used in intersectionality, so we can compare different places, different times, different scales. So we have some kind of a generic, contested and shifting meaning of particular social or cultural phenomena. Then we have the specific location, which Magnoli called it pluriversality, that epistemologically the meaning in different locations can be different. But what we are adding in situated intersectionality is not just the difference between the different universes of meaning of generic and local and in different locality and time, but also within the particular time and place from the situated gazes of the different agents of those who participate and or observe this social or cultural encounter. In this sense, the meanings of culture are situated, shifting and contested with different boundaries and different saliency, which changes focus and relevance in different local, temporal, and social perspective. This does not mean that they lack specific meaning. It just means that there is no so-called objective view from nowhere to claim this meaning. We all need to approach it from this point of dialogical, epistemological way. This more or less ends the part of the lecture in which I explain the methodology of situated intersectionality and how it should be, why is it important and useful in order to explain the meanings of culture. Before we open the floor for general discussion, both on the general issues, theoretical, methodological, which I presented until here, but also there are some direct political conclusions that emerge out of this construction of the meaning of culture. Firstly, and maybe mostly, is that inherently no one has the authority to decide what is the meaning of particular culture or what it should be. I remember there was a case in London where South Asian feminists have tried to get a budget to establish a refuge for women who suffered from domestic violence from the local authority. And the so-called leaders of South Asian community approached the local authority and said, how can you give them money as South Asian? They don't wear sari, they wear jeans. They cannot be proper Asian girls. So this analysis that I presented here of the meaning of culture would challenge any claim for authoritarian or fundamentalist which says there is only one truth, there is only one culture, there is only one true version of religion, etc. So this is the major political conclusion from this theoretical presentation. Another one, I mentioned this Atlas of UNESCO. Cultures are not mutually exclusive, territorial, as well as continuously shifting and contested. We cannot understand the world as being dominated by the Asian culture or Oriental or Western culture or Middle Eastern culture or Spanish culture. These have no meaning beyond particular situated gazes which are embedded in particular power, context, and relations of contesting voices. Thirdly, there have been, I don't know if many of you have been aware or remember, there have been a sensational kind of book which called Multiculturalism is Bad for Women, which of course adopted this very relativist approach to what culture is and said women from ethnic minorities, from Asia who migrate to the West, they, this notion of multiculturalism, of allowing cultural pluralism as part of cultural rights of citizens, are bad for women because they allow this discrimination against women, what I mentioned before about Asian values. Of course, this view, as I said, is relativist because it does not allow women to be agents as authoritative as defining what their culture is as men. If you assume, at least normatively, if not concretely, that women have the same right as men to be cultural carriers, to be cultural activists, to be artists, to be religious leaders, they have the same kind of rights and freedom as men, then the whole notion that multiculturalism is bad for women is valid only if you have either universalist in terms of civilization in which, migrant minority are in a lower stage of development, or relativist, which says they have completely different normative norms of culture. So any kind of generic normative evaluation like women's right, human rights are also women's rights, would not be part of it. But, and this kind of statement, because of other kind of debates within the feminist movement in in Britain, in the United States, and others, and in other places, it comes with a caveat, because there are some feminists, like, for example, Saba Mahmood, who have studied religious women in Cairo. And she presented what she calls the politics of piety as the equivalent of feminism in the Middle East. In other words, she is using a relativist perspective about what culture is, that in the West, feminists are fighting for equal citizenship rights, equal employment and wages and so on, but within the Muslim countries, women have the same kind of social agency by practicing their piety, by fasting more, by showing that they are better than the men within the religion in terms of practicing the different kind of Quran commands and so on. This perspective has been bought, unfortunately, by some very influential so-called post-secularist philosophers as well as feminists, from Judith Butler to Talal Asad and others, who talked about our age in, of course, a lot of substance post-enlightenment, but they call it also as post-secularist. Feminists in Egypt, in other Muslim countries, have suffered terribly from the delegitimation of their activism, because they said, no, in your context, you should be, into the politics of piety rather than the politics of, access to jobs or whatever. And of course, a lot of it has been anchored and fixated on issues of wearing headscarves or hijab and so on. Another political conclusion from what I've been saying is that cultural borderscapes are imposed on migrants, but integration of migrants should not be this one direction of imposition, but rather dialogical and enriching. While integration assumes that everybody is involved in this integration, the practice, definitely in Britain and I think a lot in other places, have been assimilations. It has been one culture is authentic. If you are in Britain, you have to follow the British values or the Spanish values or whatever. Again, collapse of values with culture, which of course is never kind of fully the same thing. Also homogenizing and essentializing. So the whole politics of the relationship and settlement of migrants in the white society is and should be much more dialogical and not, and of course the reality is that some voices are much more powerful than others, but this does not mean we should not take part in the naturalization of these assumptions, but rather with their problematization. I don't have time to develop here, which it's a whole different other kind of lecture that I give these days, about what I call the systemic double crisis of governability and governmentality as a result of global neoliberalism, which means that governments cannot govern in a way which represent the interest of their citizens, even if they want to, like, for example, Syriza in Greece, because the power of multinationals and other kind of, which are 10 times more than all the financial and other resources of all the states in the world, including United States and all the other kind of power altogether, And therefore, while neoliberal governmentality in the Foucauldian way tried to tell people that they are responsible for themselves, and if they fail, if they are not healthy, if they are not wealthy, if they can't find housing or jobs, it's their own failing. So this crisis governmentality has valley, existential anxiety that is growing among people for more and more positions in society who cannot have proper employment, housing, health, that the whole notion of entitlement as citizen is becoming less and less material. So we should not, I mean, the cultural turn that in the development of cultural studies and others in analyzing what is happening in society has been a very important complement to the political economic analysis, but it cannot be its substitute. We cannot just reduce everything to cultural reading. I think I've spoken enough, so I will pause now and we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you.